In the dead of night, a mysterious figure slips through the shadows, entering the mansion where a deadly secret lies hidden. By morning, a woman's lifeless body is discovered, her eyes wide with terror, clutching an old, faded photograph. Was this a crime of passion, or is there something far darker at play here? Detective Mortimer Cleveland must uncover the truth before more lives are claimed, but with every twist, the line between truth and deception blurs. Who can be trusted, and who is hiding the deadly secrets that could destroy them all? The wind howled through the desolate moors as the clock struck 10. Inside the dimly lit cottage, a heavy silence hung over the round wooden table where a modest supper had been set. The flickering fire cast long, uneasy shadows across the room, glinting off the polished silverware and the dull sheen of an old, threadbare tablecloth. "Is it ready?" Martha Langley's voice wavered as she clasped her hands together. A frail woman, her thinning hair pulled tightly into a bun, her sunken eyes darting anxiously toward her husband. "Everything is set," Harold Langley declared, his voice gruff yet laced with an eerie satisfaction. A burly man with a broad, ruddy face, his beady eyes glowed with a strange light under thick brows. He exhaled slowly, glancing toward the window, where rain lashed furiously against the glass. A night like this, perfect for staying in. No one in their right mind would travel these roads. "Tea then," Martha whispered. "Tea," he agreed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Warms the bones, nothing better on a night like this." Their daughter Eleanor stepped forward, carrying a steaming pot. Her delicate features were drawn, her expression oddly distant. Her sister Lillian followed close behind, setting down a plate of thickly sliced bread and cold meat. The youngest Peter trailed in last, his usual chatter absent. The family sat, the fire crackling the only sound filling the heavy silence. "A toast," Harold declared, raising his cup, "to the comfort of home and the certainty of solitude." His wife flinched, but he only chuckled, his knife slicing expertly into the corned beef. "I still don't understand why we had to move here," Eleanor muttered, breaking the silence. "This house is so," she hesitated, her voice dropping, "isolated and haunted," Lillian murmured under her breath. Harold's gaze snapped to her. "Ghost stories don't put food on the table, child. Nothing haunts this house but the wind." "That's not true," Peter whispered. "I heard something last night, footsteps, outside my door." The room fell deathly still. Martha paled, her spoon slipping from her trembling fingers, clattering against her plate. Rain lashed harder against the windows, the wind shrieking through the chimney like a wailing spectre. "Imagination," Harold grunted, though his fingers curled tightly around his fork. Nothing more. A long pause. Then just as he lifted another bite to his lips, "Knock. Knock." The sound crashed through the silence like a gunshot. Harold froze, his face draining of color. Martha let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. The children stared wide-eyed, their breath hitching. "That's impossible," Harold rasped. His eyes flickered to the locked front door, the windows bolted against the storm. No one should be out there. No one. Another knock, louder this time. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and then from just beyond the door, a voice, low, urgent and unmistakably human, spoke. "Let me in. I know what you did." The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the window panes of the old stone house perched on the lonely moor. Inside, the dim glow of candlelight flickered over the coarse linen tablecloth, casting elongated shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Mr. Harwood leaned back in his chair, surveying the table with an air of satisfaction. "A fine supper for a night like this," he murmured, his deep voice carrying over the crackling fire. His wife, a frail woman with pale, watchful eyes, clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Do you think anyone will come tonight?" she asked hesitantly. Her husband let out a short, humorless laugh. Who in their right mind would venture out on a night like this? He scoffed, tearing off a piece of bread. His eldest daughter, Eleanor, sat stiffly across from him, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "Perhaps someone in need," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, uneasy, unsettled. At that moment, A sudden gust of wind slammed against the house, and then it came. A knock, sharp, deliberate. A frozen silence fell over the room. Mrs. Harwood flinched, her breath quickening. Eleanor's eyes flickered to her father, whose expression had hardened into something unreadable. No one moved. The knock came again, more insistent this time, echoing through the stone corridors like a summons from the dead. Meanwhile, outside, Jonathan Hale stood soaked to the bone, his heart hammering against his ribs. His car had broken down miles back, and he had stumbled upon the house by sheer chance, or so he thought. He had seen the faint glow through the trees, like a beacon cutting through the storm. Now as he waited at the doorstep, an inexplicable chill crawled up his spine, something beyond the bite of the cold. The moment the door creaked open, he knew. Something was wrong. The firelit room before him looked almost picturesque, a rustic family scene frozen in time, but the air was thick with something unseen. At the head of the table, Mr. Harwood's heavy-lidded eyes met his with a sharp, assessing gaze. Beside him, Mrs. Harwood clutched her shawl tighter, her knuckles white, and then there was Eleanor. Her cup was still raised halfway to her lips, but her gaze was locked onto his, wide and unblinking. It wasn't just surprise he saw in her eyes. It was something else, a warning. The storm howled through the desolate moors, rain lashing against the earth like an unrelenting force. Daniel Whitmore pulled his coat tighter around himself, cursing his ill fortune. His car sat motionless on the muddy path, 2 tires punctured, miles away from any sign of civilization. The shortcut had been a mistake, an error of arrogance, and now he was stranded, night creeping in like a silent predator. Then in the distance, through the thick mist, a flicker of light caught his eye, a brief golden glimmer, almost swallowed by the darkness. He waited, breath caught in his throat, until the glow appeared once more, faint but certain. With no other option, he abandoned his car, trudging uphill towards the elusive beacon. The wind fought him every step of the way, the rain slashing at his face, but he pressed on until at last, emerging from the mist, he saw it, a small lonely cottage, perched on the edge of the moor. As he approached, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck, an instinctive awareness of something unseen. He rapped on the wooden door, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. For a moment nothing, then a whisper of movement within, hushed voices, the scraping of a chair. The hesitation was palpable. A moment stretched too long. When the door finally swung open, it revealed a boy, no older than 15, his eyes wide, cautious, but Daniel's gaze went beyond him, straight into the heart of the dimly lit room. The scene before him was eerily still, as though frozen in time. A round table, set for a meal, candlelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. A man tall, broad-shouldered, sat at the head, his face unreadable. Across from him, a woman with tired eyes and a nervous expression clutched her shawl, as if for protection. But it was the 2 daughters who unsettled Daniel the most. One with hair like liquid fire and piercing grey eyes, stared at him in open shock, her hand frozen mid-motion, a cup halted halfway to her lips. The other, dark-haired, pale as marble, watched him with quiet intensity, her expression devoid of fear but heavy with something else, calculation. A long silence stretched between them, before the father finally spoke, his voice slow, measured. "Stranded in the storm, are you? Well then, you'd best come inside." The storm raged on outside, the wind howling like a beast prowling through the night. Jonathan Pierce stepped into the dimly lit room, his soaked coat dripping onto the worn wooden floor. His sharp eyes took in the surroundings. An old weathered house, its atmosphere thick with an almost imperceptible tension. Across the room, a young woman sat by the fire, her crimson hair catching the flickering glow of the flames. Her beauty was striking, but it was the eerie calm in her eyes that unsettled him. Beside her stood another woman, pale as marble, her dark eyes assessing him with an unsettling intensity. The man of the house, a burly fellow with a booming voice, introduced himself as Bernard Crawley. He was friendly, too friendly, talking incessantly about his early retirement and their choice to live in this isolated corner of the countryside. His wife, seated in the corner, barely spoke, her knitting needles clicking rapidly. Jonathan could feel it in the air. Something was wrong here. The daughters, Eleanor and Isabel, exchanged glances too quickly, too deliberately. A forced smile lingered on Mrs. Crawley's lips, and the air felt thick with something unspoken. "I appreciate your hospitality," Jonathan said smoothly, accepting the warm tea placed before him. As he lifted the cup, he caught sight of Bernard's fleeting glance toward his wife, almost as if warning her. After supper, Jonathan was shown to his room, a sparse yet oddly immaculate chamber, save for the thick layer of dust coating the bedside table. Eleanor and Isabel lingered for a moment before bidding him good night, their movements hesitant, as though debating whether to say something. Once alone, he exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. It was then that he noticed it. 3 letters traced into the dust. S.O.S. A chill ran down his spine. Someone had left him a message, a silent, desperate plea for help. But who? The fiery-haired Eleanor, with her cryptic stare, or the somber, unreadable Isabel? He moved to the door, opening it a crack. The house was silent now, too silent. Jonathan's heart pounded as he whispered to himself, "Something is very, very wrong here." The first light of dawn crept through the heavy clouds, casting an eerie glow over the silent countryside. Daniel Harrington awoke with a start, a strange weight pressing against his chest, not physical, but an unmistakable sense of foreboding. Dressing quickly, he descended the creaking wooden stairs and stepped outside, inhaling the crisp morning air still thick with the scent of last night's storm. The world seemed unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. A movement at the far end of the garden caught his eye. There, standing motionless by the rickety fence, was Eleanor, her delicate frame shrouded in an oversized shawl, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the mist curled over the moors like ghostly fingers. His pulse quickened. He had been convinced since last night that it was she who had scrawled the desperate message in the dust. As he approached, she turned slowly, her expression unreadable, yet her eyes wide, uncertain, held an unspoken depth of emotion. "Good morning," he greeted, keeping his tone light, but his mind was already formulating questions. Did she remember? Did she even acknowledge the silent plea written in the dust? Eleanor offered a faint smile, but there was a hesitation in the way her fingers tightened around the fence post. "A beautiful morning," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. Daniel stooped, tracing a pattern absent-mindedly in the damp soil, a slow, deliberate S, followed by an O, then another S. His eyes never left her face. Nothing, no flicker of recognition, no telltale shift of emotion. Disappointment clawed at him, but before he could speak, she let out a sudden breath, as if making a decision. "It's strange," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the whispering breeze. "I didn't write that message, but I might as well have." Daniel's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Her fingers gripped the wood tighter. "I don't know," she admitted. "Or maybe I do. It's this house, this place. Since we arrived, it's as if something is watching, waiting." She shuddered, then glanced toward the looming silhouette of the old manor. "Everyone's different. My father, my mother, even my sister. It's like they aren't themselves anymore." A silence stretched between them. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the tension in the air, thick as the mist rolling over the land. Then, barely above a whisper, Eleanor spoke again. "You know they say this house is haunted." A slow chill crept up Daniel's spine. The wind stirred around them, and for the first time he realized he wasn't sure they were alone. Cleveland woke with a start, the remnants of a restless sleep clinging to him like cobwebs. The rain had washed the world clean, and the garden shimmered under the delicate morning sun. As he stepped out, the air felt unnaturally crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth, and something more elusive, something he couldn't quite name. His eyes traveled to the far end of the garden, where a lone figure leaned against the fence, staring out over the mist-covered downs. Charlotte. His pulse quickened, though he told himself it was merely the morning chill. He had convinced himself that she had written the message. It had to be her. As he approached, she turned, her gaze open, childlike, devoid of the secret understanding he had anticipated. "A beautiful morning," he remarked, watching her carefully, a stark contrast to last night. She nodded absently, her mind seemingly elsewhere. Cleveland reached for a fallen twig, absent-mindedly tracing shapes into the damp earth. An S, an O, another S. He stole a glance at her face, searching for a flicker of recognition, but Charlotte only frowned slightly. "Do you know what these letters mean?" His voice was casual, but his heart pounded. She hesitated, then answered, "Isn't that the distress signal ships send out?" Cleveland nodded, feeling an unexpected wave of disappointment. "Someone wrote that on the table beside my bed last night," he said quietly. "I thought it might have been you." She blinked, confusion clear in her wide eyes. "Me? No, I didn't." Something in his chest tightened. He had been so certain, and yet. They walked back toward the house in silence, Charlotte's mind clearly preoccupied. Then suddenly, she spoke in a low, hurried voice. "It's strange that you mention those letters, S.O.S. I didn't write them, but I could have." He stopped. "What do you mean?" She glanced around nervously, then whispered, I've been so afraid, Cleveland. Ever since we came here, I've felt something. The house, it's wrong. It's as if the walls are watching, and my family, father, mother, Magdalene, they've changed. They aren't the same." His skin prickled. "What do you mean, changed?" Charlotte bit her lip. "I don't know. It's subtle, small things, but it's as if they've become strangers overnight." A gust of wind stirred the trees, and Cleveland felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. "You know this house is supposed to be haunted, don't you?" she whispered. He turned to her sharply. "What?" Charlotte nodded. "A man murdered his wife here. We only found out after we moved in." She swallowed hard. "Father says ghosts are nonsense, but I don't know." Cleveland's mind raced. "Tell me something," he said. "Was the murder committed in the room I slept in last night?" Charlotte hesitated. "I don't know." But Cleveland had a growing suspicion. "Charlotte," he said carefully, "have you ever had any reason to believe you might be sensitive to things, a medium of sorts?" Her eyes widened. "No. I mean, I don't think so." "I think you wrote that message," he said gently. "Not consciously, of course, but sometimes, a place holds on to tragedy, the emotions, the terror, it lingers. If you're sensitive enough, it can influence you." Her face brightened slightly, as if grasping onto a rational explanation. "You think that's what happened?" Before he could answer, a voice called her from the house. She hesitated, then hurried inside, leaving Cleveland standing alone in the garden. He gazed up at the house, its dark windows like unblinking eyes. Was he satisfied with his own explanation? No, something wasn't right. The tension in the house last night, it wasn't just Charlotte. The others had been on edge, as though his arrival had disrupted something. But what? And then there was Johnny. Cleveland was certain about one thing: whatever haunted this house, whatever secret it held, Johnny was the only one untouched by it. Just then the boy emerged, his hands stained with dark smudges. "Breakfast's ready," he said, his voice oddly strained. Cleveland's gaze lingered on the stains. Johnny caught the look, and gave a small uneasy laugh. "I mess around with chemicals," he said. "Father hates it, wants me to go into construction, but I prefer science." Cleveland nodded absently, his thoughts elsewhere. At that moment, Mr. Dinsmead appeared at the window, his face beaming, jovial, warm, and yet the sight of him sent a cold shiver down Cleveland's spine. A man who smiled too much, a woman who seemed afraid of him, a daughter whispering of unseen fears, a message written in terror. Something was very, very wrong in this house, and Cleveland had a terrible feeling that he had just walked straight into its dark heart. The rain pounded against the ancient manor's windows as Jonathan Crane sat upright in his borrowed bed, cold sweat trickling down his back. Something had woken him, an unshakable sense of being watched. The shadows in the dimly lit room seemed to shift, and then he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible message scratched into the wood of the bedside table. S.O.S. His pulse quickened. Who had written it? Was it old, or had it been left for him? He ran a trembling hand over the letters. Just then the wind howled, rattling the glass, and a soft, almost inhuman whisper filled the air. He spun around. Nothing. The room was empty, yet a presence lingered, unseen but suffocating. At breakfast he studied the Davenports, his unwilling hosts. Mr. Davenport was all forced cheer, his eyes too sharp, too assessing. His wife, pale and brittle, barely met his gaze. Their daughters Lydia and Eleanor sat in tense silence, Lydia's hands clutching a locket she never opened, Eleanor's fingers nervously tracing the tablecloth's embroidered patterns. "Sleep well?" Lydia asked, her voice too casual. Before Jonathan could answer, Mrs. Davenport's teacup slipped from her grasp, shattering against the floor. A strangled silence followed. Mr. Davenport forced a chuckle, but Jonathan saw the unspoken warning in his eyes. Something was deeply, horribly wrong in this house. He stepped outside for air, his mind spinning. That's when he heard it. Low voices filtering through the open kitchen window. £50,000, Davenport muttered, and no one the wiser. A chill ran through Jonathan's spine. Was it blackmail, a secret inheritance, or something far worse? The back door creaked open. Eleanor stood there, her face drawn. "You should leave," she whispered urgently. "Before it's too late." But Jonathan wasn't leaving. Not yet, because he had the strangest feeling that someone had once begged for help in this very room, and no one had listened. As Mortimer sat across from Mr. Dinsmead, he sensed a growing unease hanging in the air, like a storm about to break. The conversation had shifted toward Magdalen, and Mortimer couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in the older man's voice. "She's not aware of it yet," Dinsmead muttered, almost to himself, his eyes darkening for a moment, before he snapped back to his usual genial demeanor. "She's a foundling, you see. We took her in when her mother, in a desperate situation, left her with us. No questions asked. Didn't know then, but we've found out recently. Her father was a wealthy man, a Jew no less, who only discovered the child's existence shortly before his untimely death." He paused, as if trying to gauge Mortimer's reaction. "You see, she's entitled to a fortune, a rather large one. The lawyers are involved now. The money will be hers when we tell her the truth." Mortimer allowed the weight of the story to sink in, his mind racing. A case of inheritance, a secret child, but something felt off. He kept his voice steady. "A considerable amount of money, I presume," he ventured. Dinsmead stiffened slightly but quickly recovered, his gaze sharpening. "Yes, that's right, about £60,000. Of course we had to make sure everything was above board with the lawyers." Mortimer's instincts were on high alert. This wasn't just about money, it was about control, a fortune to be claimed. Mortimer mused, leaning forward, and a young woman completely unaware of her legacy. Dinsmead chuckled, but it sounded hollow. "She'll know soon enough," he said, his voice a little too forced, as if reassuring himself. "We're taking her to London next week. She has no idea, of course." Mortimer nodded, but his mind was already spinning. As the conversation continued, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were layers to this story still hidden beneath the surface. His gaze briefly flickered to Mrs. Dinsmead, who had been quietly observing the exchange from across the room. Her expression was unreadable, but the quick, furtive glances she shot at him made Mortimer uneasy. There was fear there, a deep, unsettling fear, and then, without warning, Mrs. Dinsmead dropped something, a delicate locket. Mortimer quickly picked it up for her, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. It was a miniature of Charlotte, but it seemed strangely out of place. Too old, too faded. The same unease gripped him again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost shaking. Mortimer handed it back, noting the way she avoided looking him in the eye. He turned to leave, but something inside him urged him to stay, to probe deeper. As he made his way down the long, winding path toward his car, the stillness of the countryside pressed in around him. That's when he heard the faint rustling behind him. Without turning, he quickened his pace, but the sense of being followed remained. It wasn't the first time he had felt eyes on him that day. The entire house, the entire situation, seemed to be closing in. He didn't need to see them to know the girls were watching. Lydia, with her dark, mysterious eyes, and Eleanor, whose nervous glance always seemed to linger just a moment too long. As Mortimer reached the bushes at the edge of the property, something caught his eye, a small crumpled piece of paper, half hidden beneath a branch. He bent down to retrieve it, but before he could read it, the bushes rustled again. Someone was close, too close. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly stood up, the piece of paper crumpled in his hand. Whatever was going on here, it was much darker than he had initially thought. The truth was just out of reach, and Mortimer had the sinking feeling that discovering it would be far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. As Mortimer continued down the path, the night's eerie stillness seemed to close in around him. Suddenly the rustling of leaves broke the silence, and Magdalene emerged from the shadows, stepping onto the track in front of him. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and determination, met his. "I had to see you," she confessed, her voice shaky yet urgent. Mortimer, having anticipated this meeting, replied calmly, "I expected you." His voice held no judgment, only curiosity. Magdalene took a deep breath, her gaze dropping to the ground as she fidgeted nervously. "It was you who wrote S.O.S on the table in my room last night, wasn't it?" she asked, a question that seemed to hang heavy in the air. Mortimer's gaze softened. "Why?" he asked gently, his tone coaxing her to open up. Magdalene hesitated, turning her back to him, as she absent-mindedly tugged leaves off a nearby bush. "I don't know," she replied, her voice a mixture of confusion and desperation. "Honestly, I don't know. I need you to tell me." Mortimer pressed, his voice unwavering yet filled with understanding. Magdalene let out a long, resigned sigh before looking at him again, her eyes brimming with something that felt like an unsettling truth. She wasn't ready to speak. "I'm a practical person, Mr. Cleveland," she began, her voice steady, yet betraying an edge of fear. "I'm not one for imagining things or conjuring up fantasies, but there is something wrong in that house." She pointed back toward the looming silhouette of the mansion. "It's not just some echo from the past, it's something real, something that's been growing stronger since we arrived. Each day, it gets worse. My father is different, my mother too, even Charlotte is changing." She paused, as if weighing whether to say more. Mortimer's mind raced, but he pushed forward, not wanting to lose the thread of her words. "And Johnny?" he asked, his voice curious but sharp. Magdalene's brow furrowed, as though the question had just occurred to her. "No," she said slowly, "now that I think of it, Johnny, he's the only one who's unchanged. He wasn't affected last night, not at all." Mortimer nodded, intrigued. "And you?" he asked. Her face darkened. "I was terrified," she whispered, almost to herself, just like a child, afraid of something I couldn't name. "And then, Father, he spoke about miracles, and I prayed. I actually prayed for one." Her voice trembled at the memory, and she stopped, her gaze locking onto his, with a strange intensity. "And then you knocked on the door," she finished quietly. "I must seem mad to you," she said suddenly, her voice defensive. "No," Mortimer replied, his tone calm and reassuring. "On the contrary, you seem entirely sane. It's natural to sense danger when it's close, even if you can't see it yet." Magdalene shook her head, frustrated. "It's not that," she said quickly. "I wasn't afraid for myself. I was afraid for someone else, but I don't even know who." Her confusion mirrored his own growing unease. She continued, her voice faltering, as if confessing to something she didn't fully understand herself. "I wrote S.O.S without really thinking about it, as though something inside me was telling me to, even though I don't know what it was I wanted you to do. I don't know what I thought would happen." Mortimer, sensing the depth of her turmoil, gave her a reassuring smile. "It's all right," he said softly. "We'll figure it out." She looked at him, uncertain. "What can you do?" she asked. "A lot more than you might think," Mortimer replied, his smile carrying a hint of reassurance, though it hid the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. "Sometimes the key to solving a mystery lies in just thinking, observing closely. Now tell me, was there anything unusual, anything that stood out, just before dinner last night?" Magdalene paused, her mind trying to grasp at fleeting details. "I don't think so," she said, shaking her head. But then her face lit up with a faint recollection. "Wait, Father, he said something to Mother. Something odd, but I didn't really understand what it meant." The suspense in the air thickened, as Mortimer's mind churned, connecting the dots with precision. There was more to this story, far more than either of them knew, and as he looked at Magdalene, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something much darker. Something waiting to emerge from the shadows of that ominous house. Magdalene's voice trembled as she confided her unease to Mortimer, her expression clouded with confusion. She wasn't afraid for herself, but for something intangible that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house she was living in, a dread that grew with every passing day. Her family, her father, mother and sister Charlotte, had all become shadows of their former selves. They were different, strange even, as though some force was slowly pulling them apart, twisting them into something unrecognizable. But it was Johnny, her younger brother, who remained untouched by this creeping malaise, and that was what set the alarm bells ringing in her mind. Magdalene couldn't explain it. She was simply overcome by an inexplicable terror, as if something was about to happen, something terrible, something that could not be avoided. Mortimer listened intently, his mind piecing together the fragments of her words, sensing the growing tension around her. He reassured her that he would take matters into his own hands, though the weight of her unease hung in the air, like an ominous cloud. As she made her way back up the path to her home, Mortimer's thoughts wandered back to Johnny, the one figure seemingly unaffected by the strange happenings. His mind sharpened as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. There was something unsettling about the smallest details: a teacup, an odd comment, a glimpse of something sinister lurking just beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary day. It all clicked when he recalled a recent news story about a family poisoned by carelessness. He realized with growing dread that the tea they had been drinking might not have been as innocent as it seemed. The memory of Mr. Dinsmead's strange behavior, the odd way he poured the tea, and the chilling detail of the tea being cold, suddenly made sense. Mortimer's instincts kicked in, and he knew he had to act swiftly before the danger escalated. As the evening set in, Mortimer found himself back at the cottage, joining the family for what appeared to be a perfectly mundane meal. But the air was thick with an unspoken tension, and when Mrs. Dinsmead cried out in terror, Mortimer knew that something was about to break wide open. His calm demeanor masked the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. He had already figured out more than he should have, and now, with every passing second, the mystery seemed to twist further, revealing just how far the danger had spread. Mortimer's presence in the doorway was not an accident, it was part of his plan. The truth was closing in. The tension in the room escalated as Mortimer stood there, his eyes unwavering. Mr. Dinsmead's face, once flushed with indignation, turned a ghostly white as he stammered, "Back for what, I should like to know?" Mortimer, without missing a beat, calmly replied, "Some tea," and with a swift, practiced motion, pulled a small test tube from his pocket. He took a teacup from the table and carefully poured its contents into the test tube, his every movement deliberate, almost methodical. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the strangled gasp of Mr. Dinsmead, whose face betrayed the terror that was beginning to sink in. Mrs. Dinsmead's frantic cry only amplified the sense of impending doom. "What are you doing, Mr.?" Dinsmead managed to croak, his body trembling with fear. Mortimer's tone was calm, almost detached, as he responded, "You read the papers, I'm sure. Occasionally there's a story of a family being poisoned. Some survive, others don't. Now in this case, the initial suspicion might fall on the tinned brawn you were eating. But supposing the doctor's a bit more discerning, not so easily swayed by the food theory." His voice lowered as he let the words sink in. "There's a packet of arsenic in your larder, right next to the tea, and given the hole in the top shelf, one could easily surmise that the arsenic might have found its way into the tea by accident. An innocent mistake, really, a mistake that could easily be blamed on your son Johnny. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Dinsmead?" Now ashen, sputtered, I don't know what you mean," but Mortimer, unfazed, continued his methodical display. He took a second teacup, filled it with tea, and poured it into another test tube, attaching a red label to one and a blue label to the other. His voice cut through the room, now laced with a chilling certainty. "This," he said, holding up the red-labeled test tube, "is tea from your daughter Charlotte's cup, and the blue-labeled one is from your daughter Magdalene's, and I'm willing to bet I'll find 4 or 5 times the amount of arsenic in Charlotte's tea compared to Magdalene's." Mr. Dinsmead, unable to contain himself, finally blurted out, "You're mad." Mortimer's gaze remained steady as he replied, "Oh no, Mr. Dinsmead, I assure you I'm not. You told me yourself today that Magdalene is your biological daughter, but Charlotte, the girl you adopted, is the spitting image of her mother, a woman you knew well. In fact, when I saw a miniature of her mother today, I mistook it for Charlotte herself. Your own daughter was to inherit the fortune, and since Charlotte was such a dead ringer for her mother, you couldn't risk her being seen too much. It would have been too dangerous. Someone might have recognized the resemblance. So what better way to get rid of her than with a little arsenic at the bottom of a teacup? Mrs. Dinsmead's hysteria reached a peak as she began rocking back and forth, a high-pitched cackle escaping her lips. "Tea," she squealed, her voice shrill. "That's what he said. Tea, not lemonade." Her hysterics only served to heighten the sense of dread in the room. Mr. Dinsmead, now seething, roared at her, "Hold your tongue." Mortimer's eyes flicked across the table, where Charlotte sat, her wide, uncomprehending eyes locked on him, confused and fearful. Then, as if sensing a shift, he felt a hand on his arm. Magdalen had pulled him aside, out of earshot. Her voice, strained with worry, barely above a whisper, asked, those files, Daddy, you won't." Mortimer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but firm. "My dear, you don't believe in this madness, do you?" But in that moment, the pieces of the puzzle had already begun to fit together. Mortimer knew, without a doubt, that this twisted charade was about to unravel, and the truth was closer than ever before. Magdalen's grip tightened on Mortimer's arm as she spoke in a barely audible whisper. "I believe in the atmosphere of this house, you know. If he had never set foot in it, perhaps, just perhaps, your father wouldn't have devised the scheme he did." Her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and guilt, as if revealing too much would bring down the entire house of cards. "I keep these test tubes to protect Charlotte now," she continued, her eyes flickering with a sadness that could not be masked. "In the future, if things were to go wrong, I could still ensure her safety." Her words hung in the air like a warning, each one heavy with unspoken meaning. "Apart from that, I will do nothing, no more interference. I owe it perhaps to that hand that once wrote the S.O.S. note, the one that tied me to this twisted web of secrets." Mortimer's expression hardened, his resolve set. "Yes," he replied softly, his voice cold and calculating. "A man murdered his wife in this very house, and now as you speak, we inch closer to uncovering the truth. The truth about your father's motives, about the lethal web of deceit he spun around you all." The mystery, so thick in the air, felt almost suffocating now, like a dark presence that would not let go. Mortimer, eyes locked on Magdalen's face, understood the gravity of the situation. The stakes were higher than ever, and in this house, betrayal wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. Everything had been set in motion, and now there would be no turning back. The question was no longer if the truth would come out, but how it would unravel, and whether anyone would walk out of this house with their lives intact. Agatha Christie, the soul of the Croupier Monte Carlo, a place of dazzling lights, whispered secrets, and fortunes won and lost in the blink of an eye. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and the polished marble floors, the air crackled with tension, the kind that only money, power, and the ever-present lure of chance could create. But for one man, this city was more than just a playground of the rich. It was a stage, and he was the keenest observer of its grand performance. Mr. Satterthwaite sat on the sun-drenched terrace of the Hôtel de Paris, watching the world pass before him like a carefully orchestrated play. Every January, without fail, he escaped the dreary English winter for the golden warmth of the Riviera. He was more dependable than the swallows that migrated south, his life a meticulous arrangement of seasons and social circles. From Monte Carlo, he would return to London in April, indulging in the refined pleasures of high society. May and June were for the grand events of the capital, the opera, the theatre, Ascot, where he would never miss a race. By July, he would take in the sights of Deauville or Le Touquet, slipping seamlessly into the lavish world of country house gatherings before the crisp air of September signaled the beginning of the shooting season. And then, as the year wound down, he would return to London once more, drawing the curtain on yet another perfect cycle of a life spent in observation. Today, however, a frown creased his usually composed features. The terrace was the same, the sea beyond still a brilliant blue, and the gardens bloomed as beautifully as ever. Yet something felt off. The people, the crowd, they disappointed him. A shabbier sort of visitor had made their way to Monte Carlo this season, people who would have once never been able to afford it. Their presence unsettled him. He missed the days when the terrace was graced by grand dukes and diplomats, by elegant ladies draped in the finest Parisian silks, their jewels catching the sun as they sipped champagne. Now the elite had moved on, lured away to the snow-covered retreats of Switzerland. The old world, his world, was fading. "It's the exchange rate," he muttered to himself, his tone laced with distaste. Monte Carlo used to be exclusive. Now anyone can come. He sighed, feeling the weight of time pressing upon him. Was it truly the world that was changing, or was it simply that he was growing old? And then, just as he was about to resign himself to disappointment, a familiar figure caught his eye. The Countess Zarnova. She moved through the crowd like a panther, her every step deliberate, her presence commanding. Mr. Satterthwaite had seen her before, year after year, always in the company of powerful men, a Grand Duke, an Austrian baron, men of wealth and influence. But then her companions had begun to change. The last few years, she had been seen with men who wore their wealth like armor, diamond-studded cufflinks, heavy gold rings, a touch of ostentation that whispered of something less, and lately, she had taken to the company of much younger men. Now she walked arm in arm with one such youth, a boy really, and as Mr. Satterthwaite's sharp eyes focused on him, a flicker of recognition passed through his mind. He knew this young man, Franklin Rudge, an American, fresh-faced, full of promise, a product of the industrious Middle West, a boy who had no business in the hands of a woman like the Countess Zarnova. Mr. Satterthwaite's fingers tapped thoughtfully against the arm of his chair. The Riviera might not have been what it once was, but some things never changed. Monte Carlo was still a place where destinies were shaped, and sometimes shattered, and as the Countess led her latest conquest deeper into the city's glittering underbelly, Mr. Satterthwaite couldn't shake the feeling that this particular drama was only just beginning. Eager to register impression, crude but lovable, a curious mixture of native shrewdness and idealism, he was in Monte Carlo with a party of other young Americans of both sexes, all much of the same type. It was their first glimpse of the old world, and they were outspoken in criticism and in appreciation. On the whole, they disliked the English people in the hotel, and the English people disliked them. Mr. Satterthwaite, who prided himself on being a cosmopolitan, rather liked them. Their directness and vigor appealed to him, though their occasional solecisms made him shudder. It occurred to him that the Countess Zarnova was a most unsuitable friend for young Franklin Rudge. He took off his hat politely as they came abreast of him, and the Countess gave him a charming bow and smile. She was a very tall woman, superbly made. Her hair was black, so were her eyes, and her eyelashes and eyebrows were more superbly black than any nature had ever fashioned. Mr. Satterthwaite, who knew far more of feminine secrets than it is good for any man to know, rendered immediate homage to the art with which she was made up. Her complexion appeared to be flawless, of a uniform creamy white. The very faint bistre shadows under her eyes were most effective. Her mouth was neither crimson nor scarlet, but a subdued wine color. She was dressed in a very daring creation of black and white, and carried a parasol of the shade of pinky red, which is most helpful to the complexion. Franklin Rudge was looking happy and important. "There goes a young fool," said Mr. Satterthwaite to himself, "but I suppose it's no business of mine, and anyway he wouldn't listen to me. Well, I've bought experience myself in my time." But he still felt rather worried, because there was a very attractive little American girl in the party, and he was sure that she would not like Franklin Rudge's friendship with the Countess at all. He was just about to retrace his steps in the opposite direction, when he caught sight of the girl in question coming up one of the paths towards him. She wore a well-cut tailor-made suit with a white muslin shirt-waist. She had on good sensible walking shoes, and carried a guidebook. There are some Americans who pass through Paris, and emerge clothed as the Queen of Sheba, But Elizabeth Martin was not one of them. She was doing Europe in a stern, conscientious spirit. She had high ideas of culture and art, and she was anxious to get as much as possible for her limited store of money. It is doubtful if Mr. Satterthwaite thought of her as either cultured or artistic. To him she merely appeared very young. "Good morning, Mr. Satterthwaite," said Elizabeth. "Have you seen Franklin Mr. Rudge anywhere about?" "I saw him just a few minutes ago, with his friend the Countess, I suppose," said the girl sharply. "Oh, with the Countess, yes," admitted Mr. Satterthwaite. "That Countess of his doesn't cut any ice with me," said the girl in a rather high, shrill voice. "Franklin's just crazy about her. Why, I can't think. She's got a very charming manner, I believe," said Mr. Satterthwaite cautiously. "Do you know her?" "Slightly." "I'm right down worried about Franklin," said Miss Martin. "That boy's got a lot of sense as a rule. You'd never think he'd fall for this sort of siren stuff. And he won't hear a thing. He gets madder than a hornet if anyone tries to say a word to him. Tell me, anyway, is she a real countess?" "I shouldn't like to say," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "She may be. That's the real ha-ha English manner," said Elizabeth with signs of displeasure. "All I can say is that in Sargon Springs, that's our hometown, Mr. Satterthwaite, that countess would look a mighty queer bird." Mr. Satterthwaite thought it possible. He forbore to point out that they were not in Sargon Springs but in the Principality of Monaco, where the Countess happened to synchronize with her environment a great deal better than Miss Martin did. He made no answer, and Elizabeth went on towards the casino. Mr. Satterthwaite sat on a seat in the sun, and was presently joined by Franklin Rudge. Rudge was full of enthusiasm. "I'm enjoying myself," he announced with naive enthusiasm. "Yes, sir. This is what I call seeing life, rather a different kind of life from what we have in the States." The elder man turned a thoughtful face to him. "Life is lived very much the same everywhere," he said rather wearily. "It wears different clothes, that's all." Franklin Rudge stared. "I don't get you." "No," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "That's because you've got a long way to travel yet. But I apologize. No elderly man should permit himself to get into the habit of preaching." "Oh, that's all right," Rudge laughed, displaying the beautiful teeth of all his countrymen. "I don't say, mind you, that I'm not disappointed in the casino. I thought the gambling would be different, something much more feverish. It seems just rather dull and sordid to me. Gambling is life and death to the gambler, but it has no great spectacular value," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "It is more exciting to read about than to see." The young man nodded his agreement. "You're by way of being rather a big bug socially, aren't you?" he asked with a diffident candor that made it impossible to take offense. "I mean, you know, all the duchesses and earls and countesses and things." "A good many of them," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "and also the Jews and the Portuguese and the Greeks and the Argentines." "Eh?" said Mr. Rudge. "I was just explaining," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "that I move in English society." Franklin Rudge meditated for a moment or two. "You know the Countess Sarnova, don't you?" he said at length. "Slightly," said Mr. Satterthwaite, making the same answer he had made to Elizabeth. "Now there's a woman whom it's been very interesting to meet. One's inclined to think that the aristocracy of Europe is played out and effete. That may be true of the men, but the women are different. Isn't it a pleasure to meet an exquisite creature like the Countess? Witty, charming, intelligent, generations of civilization behind her, an aristocrat to her fingertips." "Is she?" asked Mr. Satterthwaite. "Well, isn't she? You know what her family are?" "No," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "I'm afraid I know very little about her. She was a Radzinski," he explained Franklin Rudge. "One of the oldest families in Hungary. She's had the most extraordinary life. You know that great rope of pearls she wears?" Mr. Satterthwaite nodded. "That was given her by the King of Bosnia. She smuggled some secret papers out of the kingdom for him." "I heard," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "that the pearls had been given her by the King of Bosnia. The fact was indeed a matter of common gossip, it being reported that the lady had been a chair amie of His Majesty's in days gone by. Now I'll tell you something more. Mr. Satterthwaite listened, and the more he listened the more he admired the fertile imagination of the Countess Sarnova. No vulgar siren stuff, as Elizabeth Martin had put it for her. The young man was shrewd enough in that way, Dean living and idealistic. No, the Countess moved austerely through a labyrinth of diplomatic intrigues. She had enemies, detractors naturally. It was a glimpse, so the young American was made to feel, into the life of the old regime with the Countess as the central figure, aloof, aristocratic, the friend of councillors and princes, a figure to inspire romantic devotion. And she's had any amount to contend against. He ended the young man warmly. It's an extraordinary thing, but she's never found a woman who would be a real friend to her. Women have been against her all her life. Probably, said Mr. Satterthwaite. Don't you call it a scandalous thing? Demanded Rudge hotly. No, said Mr. Satterthwaite thoughtfully. I don't know that I do. Women have got their own standards, you know. It's no good our mixing ourselves up in their affairs. They must run their own show. I don't agree with you, said Rudge earnestly. It's one of the worst things in the world today, the unkindness of woman to woman. You know Elizabeth Martin, now she agrees with me in theory absolutely. We've often discussed it together. She's only a kid, but her ideas are all right. But the moment it comes to a practical test, why, she's as bad as any of them. Got a real down on the Countess without knowing a darn thing about her, and won't listen when I try to tell her things. It's all wrong, Mr. Satterthwaite. I believe in democracy, and what's that but brotherhood between men and sisterhood between women? He paused earnestly. Mr. Satterthwaite tried to think of any circumstances in which a sisterly feeling might arise between the Countess and Elizabeth Martin, and failed. Now the Countess, on the other hand, went on Rudge, admires Elizabeth immensely, and thinks her charming in every way. Now what does that show? It shows, said Mr. Satterthwaite dryly, that the Countess has lived a considerable time longer than Miss Martin has. Franklin Rudge went off unexpectedly at a tangent. Do you know how old she is? She told me, rather sporting of her. I should have guessed her to be 29. But she told me of her own accord that she was 35. She doesn't look it, docks she. Mr. Satterthwaite, whose private estimate of the lady's age was between 45 and 49, merely raised his eyebrows. I should caution you against believing all you are told at Monte Carlo, he murmured. He had enough experience to know the futility of arguing with the lad. Franklin Rudge was at a pitch of white-hot chivalry when he would have disbelieved any statement that was not backed with authoritative proof. Here is the Countess, said the boy, rising. She came up to them with the languid grace that so became her. Presently they all three sat down together. She was very charming to Mr. Satterthwaite, but in rather an aloof manner. She deferred to him prettily, asking his opinion, and treating him as an authority on the Riviera. The whole thing was cleverly managed. Very few minutes had elapsed before Franklin Rudge found himself gracefully but unmistakably dismissed, and the Countess and Mr. Satterthwaite were left tête-à-tête. She put down her parasol, and began drawing patterns with it in the dust. You are interested in that nice American boy, Mr. Satterthwaite, are you not? Her voice was low with a caressing note in it. He's a nice young fellow, said Mr. Satterthwaite, non-committally. I find him sympathetic. Yes, said the Countess reflectively. I have told him much of my life. Indeed, said Mr. Satterthwaite. Details such as I have told to few others, she continued dreamily. I have had an extraordinary life, Mr. Satterthwaite. Few would credit the amazing things that have happened to me. Mr. Satterthwaite was shrewd enough to penetrate her meaning. After all, the stories that she had told to Franklin Rudge might be the truth. It was extremely unlikely and in the last degree improbable, but it was possible. No one could definitely say that is not so. He did not reply, and the Countess continued to look out dreamily across the bay. And suddenly Mr. Satterthwaite had a strange and new impression of her. He saw her no longer as a harpy but as a desperate creature at bay fighting tooth and nail. He stole a sideways glance at her. The parasol was down, he could see the little haggard lines at the corners of her eyes. In one temple a pulse was beating. It flowed through him again and again, that increasing certitude. She was a creature desperate and driven. She would be merciless to him or to anyone who stood between her and Franklin Rudge. But he still felt he hadn't got the hang of the situation. Clearly she had plenty of money. She was always beautifully dressed and her jewels were marvelous. There could be no real urgency of that kind. Was it love? Women of her age did, he well knew, fall in love with boys. It might be that. There was, he felt sure, something out of the common about the situation. Her tête-à-tête with him was, he recognized, a throwing down of the gauntlet. She had singled him out as her chief enemy. He felt sure that she hoped to goad him into speaking slightingly of her to Franklin Rudge. Mr. Satterthwaite smiled to himself. He was too old a bird for that. He knew when it was wise to hold one's tongue. He watched her that night in the Circle Prive as she tried her fortunes at roulette. Again and again she staked, only to see her stake swept away. She bore her losses well with the stoical sang-froid of the old habitué. She staked en plein once or twice, put the maximum on red, won a little on the middle dozen and then lost it again. Finally she backed Monk 6 times and lost every time. Then with a little graceful shrug of the shoulders she turned away. She was looking unusually striking in a dress of gold tissue with an underlying note of green. The famous Bosnian pearls were looped round her neck and long pearl earrings hung from her ears. Mr. Satterthwaite heard 2 men near him appraise her. "The Tsar Nova," said one, "she wears well, does she not? The crown jewels of Bosnia look fine on her." The other, a small Jewish-looking man, stared curiously after her. "So those are the pearls of Bosnia, are they?" he asked. "En verite, that is odd." He chuckled softly to himself. Mr. Satterthwaite missed hearing more, for at the moment he turned his head and was overjoyed to recognize an old friend. "My dear Mr. Quinn," he shook him warmly by the hand. "The last place I should ever have dreamed of seeing you." Mr. Quinn smiled, his dark attractive face lighting up. "It should not surprise you," he said. "It is carnival time. I am often here in carnival time." "Really? Well, this is a great pleasure. Are you anxious to remain in the rooms? I find them rather warm." "It will be pleasanter outside," agreed the other. "We will walk in the gardens." The air outside was sharp but not chill. Both men drew deep breaths. "That is better," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Much better," agreed Mr. Quinn. "And we can talk freely. I am sure that there is much that you want to tell me." "There is indeed." Speaking eagerly, Mr. Satterthwaite unfolded his perplexities. As usual, he took pride in his power of conveying atmosphere. The Countess, young Franklin, uncompromising Elizabeth, he sketched them all in with a deft touch. "You have changed since I first knew you," said Quinn, smiling when the recital was over. "In what way?" "You were content then to look on at the drama that life offered. Now you want to take part, to act." "It is true," confessed Mr. Satterthwaite, "but in this case I do not know what to do. It is all very perplexing." Perhaps he hesitated. "Perhaps you will help me." "With pleasure," said Mr. Quinn. "We will see what we ran do." Mr. Satterthwaite had an odd sense of comfort and reliance. The following day he introduced Franklin Rudge and Elizabeth Martin to his friend Mr. Harley Quinn. He was pleased to see that they got on together. The Countess was not mentioned, but at lunchtime he heard news that aroused his attention. "Mirabelle is arriving in Monte this evening," he confided excitedly to Mr. Quinn. "The Parisian stage favorite. Yes. I dare say you know it's common property she is the King of Bosnia's latest craze. He has showered jewels on her, I believe. They say she is the most exacting and extravagant woman in Paris. It should be interesting to see her and the Countess Tsarnova meet tonight." Exactly what I thought. Mirabelle was a tall, thin creature with a wonderful head of dyed fair hair. Her complexion was a pale mauve with orange lips. She was amazingly chic. She was dressed in something that looked like a glorified bird of paradise, and she wore chains of jewels hanging down her bare back. A heavy bracelet set with immense diamonds clasped her left ankle. She created a sensation when she appeared in the casino. "Your friend the Countess will have a difficulty in outdoing this," murmured Mr. Quinn in Mr. Satterthwaite's ear. The latter nodded. He was curious to see how the Countess comported herself. She came late, and a low murmur ran round as she walked unconcernedly to one of the center roulette tables. She was dressed in white, a mere straight slip of Marroquin, such as a debutante might have worn, and her gleaming white neck and arms were unadorned. She wore not a single jewel. "It is clever that," said Mr. Satterthwaite with instant approval. "She disdains rivalry and turns the tables on her adversary." He himself walked over and stood by the table. From time to time he amused himself by placing a stake. Sometimes he won, more often he lost. There was a terrific run on the last dozen. The numbers 31 and 34 turned up again and again. Stakes flocked to the bottom of the cloth. With a smile, Mr. Satterthwaite made his last stake for the evening, and placed the maximum on number 5. The Countess in her turn leant forward and placed the maximum on number 6. "Fates Vosges," called the croupier, hoarsely. "Rien und va plus rien." The ball span humming merrily. Mr. Satterthwaite thought to himself, "This means something different to each of us. Agonies of hope and despair, boredom, idle amusement, life and death." Click. The croupier bent forward to see. "Numero 5, rouge impair et manque." Mr. Satterthwaite had won. The croupier, having raked in the other stakes, pushed forward Mr. Satterthwaite's winnings. He put out his hand to take them. The Countess did the same. The croupier looked from one to the other of them. Madame," he said brusquely. The Countess picked up the money. Mr. Satterthwaite drew back. He remained a gentleman. The Countess looked him full in the face, and he returned her glance. One or two of the people round pointed out to the croupier that he had made a mistake, but the man shook his head impatiently. He had decided. That was the end. He raised his raucous cry, "Pates vos airs, messieurs et mesdames." Mr. Satterthwaite rejoined, "Mr. Quinn." Beneath his impeccable demeanor, he was feeling extremely indignant. Mr. Quinn listened sympathetically. "Too bad," he said, "but these things happen. We are to meet your friend Franklin Rudge later. I am giving a little supper party." The three met at midnight, and Mr. Quinn explained his plan. "It is what is called a hedges and highways party," he explained. "We choose our meeting place, then each one goes out, and is bound in honor to invite the first person he meets." Franklin Rudge was amused by the idea. "Say what happens if they won't accept. You must use your utmost powers of persuasion." "Good. And where's the meeting place?" "A somewhat bohemian café, where one can take strange guests. It is called Le Caveau." He explained its whereabouts, and the three parted. Mr. Satterthwaite was so fortunate as to run straight into Elizabeth Martin, and he claimed her joyfully. They reached Le Caveau, and descended into a kind of cellar, where they found a table spread for supper, and lit by old-fashioned candles in candlesticks. "We are the first," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Ah, here comes Franklin." He stopped abruptly. With Franklin was the Countess. It was an awkward moment. Elizabeth displayed less graciousness than she might have done. The Countess, as a woman of the world, retained the honors. Last of all came Mr. Quinn. With him was a small dark man, neatly dressed, whose face seemed familiar to Mr. Satterthwaite. A moment later he recognized him. It was the croupier who earlier in the evening had made such a lamentable mistake. "Let me introduce you to the company, Pierre Vaucher," said Mr. Quinn. The little man seemed confused. Mr. Quinn performed the necessary introductions easily and lightly. Supper was brought, an excellent supper. Wine came, very excellent wine. Some of the frigidity went out of the atmosphere. The Countess was very silent, so was Elizabeth. Franklin Rudge became talkative. He told various stories, not humorous stories, but serious ones. And quietly and assiduously, Mr. Quinn passed round the wine. I'll tell you, and this is a true story about a man who made good, said Franklin Rudge impressively. For one coming from a prohibition country, he had shown no lack of appreciation of champagne. He told his story, perhaps at somewhat unnecessary length. It was, like many true stories, greatly inferior to fiction. As he uttered the last word, Pierre Vaucher, opposite him, seemed to wake up. He also had done justice to the champagne. He leaned forward across the table. I too will tell you a story, he said thickly. But mine is the story of a man who did not make good. It is the story of a man who went, not up, but down the hill, and like yours, it is a true story. Pray tell it to us, monsieur, said Mr. Satterthwaite courteously. Pierre Vaucher leant back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. It is in Paris that the story begins. There was a man there, a working jeweler. He was young and light-hearted, and industrious in his profession. They said there was a future before him. A good marriage was already arranged for him, the bride not too bad-looking, the dowry most satisfactory. And then what do you think? One morning he sees a girl, such a miserable little wisp of a girl, messieurs, beautiful. Yes, perhaps, if she were not half-starved, but anyway, for this young man, she has a magic that he cannot resist. She has been struggling to find work. She is virtuous, or at least that is what she tells him. I do not know if it is true. The Countess's voice came suddenly out of the semi-darkness. Why should it not be true? There are many like that. Well, as I say, the young man believed her, and he married her, an act of folly. His family would have no more to say to him. He had outraged their feelings. He married, I will call her Jenny. It was a good action. He told her so. He felt that she should be very grateful to him. He had sacrificed much for her sake. A charming beginning for the poor girl, observed the Countess sarcastically. He loved her, yes, but from the beginning she maddened him. She had moods, tantrums. She would be cold to him one day, passionate the next. At last he saw the truth. She had never loved him. She had married him so as to keep body and soul together. That truth hurt him. It hurt him horribly, but he tried his utmost to let nothing appear on the surface. And he still felt he deserved gratitude and obedience to his wishes. They quarreled. She reproached him, mon Dieu. What did she not reproach him with? You can see the next step, can you not? The thing that was bound to come. She left him. For 2 years he was alone, working in his little shop, with no news of her. He had one friend, Absinthe. The business did not prosper so well. And then one day, he came into the shop to find her sitting there. She was beautifully dressed. She had rings on her hands. He stood considering her. His heart was beating, but beating. He was at a loss what to do. He would have liked to have beaten her, to have clasped her in his arms, to have thrown her down on the floor and trampled on her, to have thrown himself at her feet. He did none of those things. He took up his pincers and went on with his work. Madame desires, he asked formally. That upset her. She did not look for that, you see. Pierre, she said, I have come back. He laid aside his pincers and looked at her. You wish to be forgiven, he said. You want me to take you back. You are sincerely repentant. Do you want me back? She murmured. Oh, very softly she said it. He knew she was laying a trap for him. He longed to seize her in his arms, but he was too clever for that. He pretended indifference. I am a Christian man, he said. I try to do what the church directs. Ah, he thought, I will humble her to her knees. But Jenny, that is what I will call her, flung back her head and laughed. Evil laughter it was. I mock myself at you, little Pierre, she said. Look at these rich clothes, these rings and bracelets. I came to show myself to you. I thought I would make you take me in your arms, and when you did so, then I would spit in your face and tell you how I hated you. And on that she went out of the shop. Can you believe, messieurs, that a woman could be as evil as all that to come back only to torment me? No, said the Countess. I would not believe it, and any man who was not a fool would not believe it either. But all men are blind fools.
Pierre Valchet took no notice of her. He went on, and so that young man of whom I tell you sank lower and lower. He drank more absinthe. The little shop was sold over his head. He became of the dregs, of the gutter. Then came the war. Ah, it was good, the war. It took that man out of the gutter, and taught him to be a brute beast no longer. It drilled him, and sobered him. He endured cold and pain, and the fear of death, but he did not die, and when the war ended, he was a man again. It was then, messieurs, that he came south. His lungs had been affected by the gas. They said he must find work in the south. I will not weary you with all the things he did. Suffice it to say that he ended up as a croupier, and there in the casino one evening, he saw her again, the woman who had ruined his life. She did not recognize him, but he recognized her. She appeared to be rich, and to lack for nothing, but messieurs, the eyes of a croupier are sharp. There came an evening when she placed her last stake in the world on the table. Ask me not how I know. I do know, one feels these. The moment was charged with a strange suffocating intensity. The Countess Tsarnova leaned back against the open window, her silhouette framed against the dark night sky of Monte Carlo. A long shuddering sigh escaped her lips, a sigh that seemed to carry with it the weight of years of loss, of despair, of a battle fought in the shadows where no one ever truly wins.
She spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet it cut through the stillness like the edge of a blade. Yes, it was a great moment, she murmured, her eyes distant as though she were looking back across the years at a ghost only she could see. 2 nights I watched her, lose, lose and lose again, and then tonight she reached the end. A final gamble, the last throw of the dice. Her fingers trembled slightly as they traced the rim of her glass. It was the only sign of emotion she allowed herself. She would never admit to weakness. Never. She put everything she had left on one number, she continued, her voice growing colder. Everything. And beside her, an English milord, calm, indifferent, staked the maximum on the next number, barely glancing at the wheel. He had no real stake in the game, not like her. For her, it was life or death. She paused. The room held its breath. The ball rolled. The words hung in the air, filled with a quiet, suffocating dread. The moment arrived. The final second when fate reveals itself, and she lost. Silence. She closed her eyes for the briefest of moments, as if reliving the agony of that instant. Her eyes met mine. There was something raw, something electric in those words. Mr. Satterthwaite could almost see it, the desperate hollow stare of a woman whose world had just shattered. A woman standing on the precipice of ruin, waiting for the abyss to claim her. Pierre Valchet's lips curled into a small, cunning smile. "What did I do?" he said, his tone half mocking, half triumphant. "I risked my own position at the casino. I broke the rules. I robbed the English milord." He gave a careless shrug, and I turned to her, placed the money in her hands and said, "Madam." His voice was light, almost teasing, but there was an edge beneath it, a question unspoken. Why had he done it? The answer came not in words but in movement. With a sharp, sudden motion, the Countess sprang to her feet, her glass sweeping off the table and shattering on the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness of the room. "Why?" she demanded, her voice taut with emotion. "That's what I want to know. Why did you do it?" A deadly silence fell between them. The tension was unbearable. It stretched like a wire between them, thin and razor-sharp, waiting to snap. The Countess stood motionless, her breath coming fast. Pierre Valchet, across the table, remained equally still, but his eyes glittered with something unreadable. For a long, long moment, neither spoke. The air between them crackled like a live wire. It was a duel, not of swords, but of wills. Then at last the smile returned to Valchet's lips. A slow, knowing, almost cruel smile. He raised his hands, palms outward, as if surrendering. "Madam," he said softly, "there is such a thing as pity.
A strange expression crossed the Countess's face, and then just as suddenly as she had erupted in fury, she was calm again, smiling. The picture of elegance, the perfect mask of an aristocrat who had seen it all and could not be shaken. "I see," she murmured. She reached for the candle, her movements smooth, unhurried. A delicate hand tore a slip of paper and rolled it into a spill. Then with effortless grace, she leaned forward and lit it, holding it out for Pierre Volcher. "A light for your cigarette, monsieur," she said, her voice almost playful now. Volcher hesitated, for only a fraction of a second before leaning in. The flame caught the tip of his cigarette, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met once more. A challenge passed between them, unspoken, but unmistakable. Then without another word, the Countess turned. "I must leave you now," she said lightly. "Please, no one needs to escort me." And before anyone could react, she was gone. Mr. Satterthwaite made a half movement to follow, but a sharp exclamation from Volcher stopped him. "A thousand thunders!" The Frenchman was staring down at the table, his face a mask of shock. His fingers trembled as he picked up the half-burned slip of paper the Countess had dropped. He unrolled it slowly. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. A 50,000-franc banknote. The Countess's winnings, everything she had left in the world, and she had lit his cigarette with it. Mr. Satterthwaite inhaled sharply, because she was too proud to accept pity. Volcher let out a low, incredulous laugh. His expression shifted, astonishment giving way to admiration. "Ah," he murmured, shaking his head. "Proud. She was always proud as the devil. She is unique, wonderful." He pushed back his chair with sudden urgency, sprang to his feet, and darted out after her. Across the table, Mr. Satterthwaite and Mr. Quinn had risen as well, watching the scene unfold with silent fascination. At that moment, the waiter approached Franklin Rudge. "La note, monsieur," he said, unemotionally, placing the bill in front of the young American. Mr. Quinn intervened smoothly, plucking the bill before Franklin could react. "I feel kind of lonesome, Elizabeth," Franklin murmured, turning to the young woman beside him. "These foreigners, they beat the band. I don't understand them. What does it all mean anyhow?" His voice held a plaintive, almost childlike confusion. Elizabeth smiled at him, 100% American, steady, grounded, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that had played out at the table moments ago. "Gee," Franklin sighed, "it's good to look at something so familiar." Mr. Quinn watched them go, a faint smile playing on his lips. Mr. Satterthwaite preened himself like a contented bird. "Well," he said, with evident satisfaction, "that's all gone off splendidly. Our pair of lovebirds will be all right now." Mr. Quinn raised an eyebrow. "Which ones?" Mr. Satterthwaite hesitated. "Oh," he said, taken aback. "Oh, yes, I suppose you're right, allowing for the Latin point of view and all that." He looked uncertain. Mr. Quinn said nothing, but the colored glass behind him bathed him momentarily in a play of light and shadow, transforming his figure into something both familiar and strangely otherworldly. And then with a quiet chuckle, he turned away.